Good afternoon and welcome back. Another episode of Go Fight Yourself. We're a little bit late today. Apologies for everybody that is used to us being on at exactly 12:30 p.m. Eastern, but we are a live show. Sometimes things happen, specifically when the producers and Kiara are gone. It's on me, and this is not my strong suit organization. So here we are. Anyways, today we're joined again with our good friend, Mr. Patrick Kiefer. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Fresh off the plane from Mexico City back to freezing cold Miami.
That's right. Yeah.
Attaboy. Hey, I know we've gone through this every day that you've been on the pod this week, but maybe if you just want to spend a minute or two explaining who you are, what's Arrow Markets, and how people can check you out.
Of course. Yep. Patrick Kiefer. I'm a PhD economist and a self-taught software developer and builder, co-founder of Arrow Markets. Check us out on Twitter at Arrow Markets. My Twitter is at 0xprotean. Arrow Markets is doing a lot right now, so please kind of keep an eye on that. We just released a mainnet product for ex-US users, and we'll be rolling out a lot of new things over the course of the spring. I also think a lot of kind of the architecture decisions that have been made at Arrow are really interesting in the context of this kind of hybrid space or space that uses what are called intents rather than transactions. And so, check us out to see kind of how we reason about some of those architecture decisions, because I think it's really kind of, forward looking.
Yeah, we're going to lean into that a little bit today. It is crypto arms race, so we're going to be talking about regulation globally and, what different jurisdictions are doing to maintain competitiveness or to overtake competitiveness, I guess. We're going to talk a little bit today about GSR in Singapore and their license. We're going to talk about crypto payments at a very iconic Australian sports venue. We're going to talk a little bit about Argentinian regulation. We'll talk a little bit about Binance in Nigeria. We're going to talk about Ripple and their stablecoin. And we'll finish off a little bit talking about another U.S. government seized 40 million buckaroonies. We will talk about that. But most importantly, I think we want to talk to begin the pod today about some of the risk premium of regulation and kind of what the state of the union is from our perspective as builders that are in the space. Where are we at? Where are we going? What are our major concerns? I think, Patrick, anything else? Anything else we're going to cover? Or does that sound like a whole episode worth?
Sounds like that sounds like a whole episode.
All right, let's fucking go. All right, we're back. Okay, so for those of you that don't know, Patrick and I are also really good friends, and we talk a lot offline about how we're going to change the world and save ourselves from ourselves. But one thing we talk a lot about, and we have since the beginning of knowing each other, really, is kind of what is the regulatory landscape shaping up to be? What is that kind of transitory process going to be? Is there going to be an overlapping contact surface, or is it going to be, one of either regulation or not regulation wins? And we talk a lot about this. I think we're wrong a lot about this in terms of predictions. But what I'd love from you, Patrick, since you're much more an authority on this than I am, kind of what are your thoughts on the state of global regulation? I think we can all agree that it's probably happened slower than we would hope. But kind of where are you at on that globally, just from a macro perspective?
Yeah, I think there's still an enormous amount of uncertainty globally about the implications of regulation for not only how kind of crypto is traded, who can hold it, how it can be transacted, but also what type of applications are available, who the applications are available to, and so forth. Obviously, in the US, we had, I think, significant good news in terms of the approval of the BTC ETF. I think we're approaching consensus among policymakers that BTC is not a security. I don't think we're anywhere out of the woods on any of the other cryptos, though. And so I think particularly when you look at the U.S., we might expect to see something like a regulatory risk premium that varies across some of these different cryptocurrencies. So I was just mentioning that I think BTC is the closest to being in the clear in terms of being designated as a security, but you can go out in the tail and there are other coins that I think are still it's still up in the air, and depending on how those sales were constructed and depending on kind of how the entities were formed and so forth, I think we could probably rank a lot of the cryptocurrencies that are trading in the US in terms of how exposed they are to new regulatory news coming out in the future. And I would put BTC as least exposed, and then I would go down and I really hate to mention any specific coins, but I think the kind of the coins that were structured in a way like Solana, I think are a little bit more prone to future announcements or enforcement actions from the SEC, the CFTC. So I would put a larger regulatory risk premium on those. And then as you go even further out, I think you can start to look at some of the applications that are available to US users. For us at Arrow, one of the most important things for us to do while we're in this period of kind of uncertainty about what regulations look like in the US is to really go out of our way to make sure that US users can't access the applications. And so it's unfortunate, but that's what we have to do given the regulatory environment. And I think there are other, I'm not going to name names, but there are clearly different projects who have kind of approached this with a different degree of aggressiveness. And I'd say the ones who have not taken sufficient steps to block US users are also probably subject to something like a regulatory risk premium. Do
you have a sense of how to maybe, or how the market or how sophisticated participants are quantifying that risk premium? Is any idea how you would begin quantifying that?
It's a really interesting question. I think one way to quantify it would be to go look historically at the implications from some of these previous regulatory announcements. So when enforcement actions were announced against Coinbase, against Ripple, and so forth, when some of these news items came out, what you can do is you can look at how the prices of the coins change as a function of those announcements. And so that would be a natural way to quantify it. The coins who dropped more aggressively on that news would have a higher regulatory risk premium.
That's kind of it'd be interesting to come up to see like a ranking model of that, like to start building in terms of your risk assessment process, something where you're looking at that, different types of risk premium based on their impact or their susceptibility to news events or whatever types of shocks. Same way that we look at Bitcoin dominance, altcoin dominance, US dollar to Bitcoin dominance, et cetera, et cetera. We look at all of that as kind of quasi indicators of trying to figure out how to price risk, really.
Yeah. So if you really wanted to kind of, if you really wanted an aggressive exposure to the regulatory risk premium and you had a compelling way to rank all of these different assets, like you were just saying, one way to rank them would just be, like I was saying, kind of just run a linear regression on some of these past regulatory announcements and just rank based on the exposure, in the historical time series. And then if you did have a ranking, you could form portfolios that were, long the most exposed and short the least exposed. You could flip that around depending on which direction you wanted it. But in principle, there are ways to kind of quantify what this premium should be and actually form portfolios that are designed to be exposed just to that risk premium. So, and I'm not sure how many people are doing this type of thing in crypto yet, but this type of procedure for portfolio formation is very, very common in TradFi. Equity funds, this is basically all they do.
This is the type of thing that firms try to find an edge, right? This is where firms try to find an edge. If we can find other ways of understanding and pricing risk, avoiding and mitigating risk, then of course we're going to be more successful than the guy next to us, because really most trading is zero sum. I mean, someone has to lose per se, or someone has to sell for you to buy. So yeah, anyways, very interesting. I think, one other thing I wanted to ask you about, Patrick, is a term that I just made up today called regulatory fragmentation. And so this is something that's been kind of problematic for me, and I've been talking about this for a while, but I'd like your perspective. What I mean by this is we're seeing, and we're going to talk specifically about how different jurisdictions on the pod today are addressing regulation. The challenge that I see is so much of the innovative benefit of blockchain and crypto is really in the ability to have so much greater access, real-time access to this type of data. Anybody has access to this type of data to continue building these systems. The problem is the rules are different everywhere. And so we have all of these beautiful composable protocols and platforms, but all of a sudden we have to understand, in the order of 100+ regulatory regimes and what all the rules are and where they're different and how we can come into compliance. To me, it seems incredibly problematic, especially right now, because there's no meaningful, generally accepted quasi-global standard. And so I guess my question for you is this going to get worse, or is this just what we see from your perspective until we get to a point of consensus?
That's a great question. I agree there is a lot of fragmentation, and this creates additional costs for people who want to use the technology, but also people who want to build with the technology. I think if we do start to get some consensus in some of the major jurisdictions like the US, we're seeing some in the EU. We obviously aren't seeing consensus in the US at this point. We have seen more. I'd say we've made more progress toward consensus in the EU. My guess is once we have some of these major jurisdictions that settle on kind of their regulatory approach, that a lot of the smaller jurisdictions will kind of adjust the way that they're regulating these technologies to be at least largely consistent with the way some of the major jurisdictions are approaching it. So my guess is, yeah, right now it's very fragmented. Probably the fragmentation will continue for a while, but once we get some type of clarity from the major jurisdictions, I think you'll see a lot of smaller jurisdictions kind of, I don't want to say fall in line, but it makes sense for them to regulate the technology in a similar way.
Yeah, I mean, for the longest time, I thought, okay, we're going to see some major Western jurisdictions probably lead the charge on this. We already have very well-established regulatory frameworks in Western countries. People are used to regulation. People are used to compliance. But unfortunately, for some reason, Western jurisdictions seem to drag their feet, with the exception maybe of the EU. They were pretty proactive with MiCA relative to other Western jurisdictions. And I've struggled to understand the logic. Like, to me, the only thing that explains any of this is either politics, which is probably a pretty big piece. We have a really divided populace in the United States and in many Western jurisdictions at the moment. So they can't agree on damn near anything specific, let alone regulation. So it's kind of interesting. The only other explanation is that maybe, I don't know, there's some strategy in watching what these other jurisdictions do and using those experiences to inform your own regulatory structure. That could be the case. One final thought on this. One thing that I kind of struggle with, well, not kind of, one thing that I really struggle with in this kind of transition phase is at what point is your historical actions not susceptible to regulatory crackdowns? And so what I mean by that is, I mean, many of us, yourself, us, Benki, many of the protocols in the space have been around long enough that regulation wasn't even, it was on the radar a little bit, but it wasn't something that was like meaningfully enforced, or there was any like, crazy adjustments that groups were making to try to adhere, because the rules just weren't there. And so what we're seeing now, though, is we're seeing a lack of rules still trying to be enforced. And to me, that's problematic because there's things that you could have been completely unaware of when you first started as being an issue that now some of these groups are being penalized for. Obviously, there's two camps in terms of the of course there's two camps in terms of the argument. One that thinks rah everything's good, and one that thinks that crypto's bad and it's going to cause all these problems and we need to regulate the shit out of it. I don't know. I'm a little frustrated at how this has been rolled out, and I'm concerned about the future. I think from a protocol perspective, how do we possibly come into compliance with all of these jurisdictions and all of these different rules? We have users from all over the world. That's one of the beauties of blockchain and crypto, is that borderless, but it also creates incredible challenges. What are your thoughts on this? Are we gonna, as a space, should we expect a fairly significant transition kind of challenge? Do you think this will be problematic for many of us? And do you think this is what's going to precipitate the next bear?
I mean, I hope not. I think that the challenge for people who are building financial technologies in this space in terms of regulation is how to penetrate some of these major jurisdictions like the US. And, like you're saying right now, the SEC, there aren't clear rules set out. There's regulation by enforcement. And so you are at risk of things that maybe you thought were carried out according to precedent historically, that they then decide are worth making some type of enforcement action against. And if we had clear rules spelled out, then we wouldn't be subject to that risk. So, that being said, the SEC does have global reach, but it's tenuous if you don't have any US users, right? So, I mean, that's kind of the trouble area, is how do you penetrate markets like the US? And I know at Arrow Markets, we work closely. We have a very good attorney who is a former CFTC prosecutor, and we work very closely with him in terms of our terms of service, making sure this is not available in the US, but also simultaneously making sure we're talking to policymakers, talking to regulators, and trying to figure out what it will take to make this technology available in a compliant way to US users in the future. But to your point, that is that is an uphill battle. That is kind of a steep path right now.
The challenge is, like, launching a new protocol today. Of course, we can put in enough stopgaps to, with a high degree of confidence, ensure that there's no US persons that hold your token, that can use your protocol. There's many ways to do that. But again, many of these protocols that are seeing enforcement actions existed well before any of us thought that was a real concern. So, and you can't put the monkeys back in the barrel once they're out in this particular case. And so, I don't know. I struggle with this again as a protocol. Is how do we possibly navigate this in a meaningful way? And a good transition, I think, to the next topic today is one of my criticisms, again, of some of these jurisdictions that have been a little bit regulatory forward relative to the rest of the world, Singapore of late kind of being one of them, is that they talk about crypto regulation and they get all excited, and the whole world gets excited that these jurisdictions have come up with some frameworks. But then after 6, 12, 18 months, they've only approved 1 or 2 or 3 applications, 5 applications out of hundreds. And that's problematic too. So, okay, jurisdiction puts in rules. Everybody has to adhere to them, obviously. How do you possibly do that if you can't even get licensing within a reasonable time frame? And if so many applications are denied, we have to have a way for people to come into compliance. Anyways, this is one of those things that, although very good, GSR has been around for a long time. Obviously, we know them fairly well and have worked with them in different capacities. It's not surprising that they were eligible for a Singapore license. They've obviously got deep relationships. I think this is great. But again, if you look at a little bit more of kind of the approval history, so to speak, of these applications, there's very, very few that are getting approved. So
Yeah.
what happens then? Do all these
Yeah.
people just have to stop participating immediately? I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I mean, there's a real you're touching on. I think there's real tension. There's a real challenge here, and I don't think we have a good kind of answer for it. And the challenge is, as we move toward a world where we get more regulatory clarity, it's important to keep in mind that there's kind of an unholy alliance between incumbents and regulators. And so as you start getting more and more regulatory clarity, part of the reason that's happening is because incumbents are working with policymakers to make sure that they have access to these markets, and that their competition, it's harder for their competition to access these markets. And so I think as we move in the direction of regulatory clarity, I don't know what the right way is to kind of push back against that force between,
I'm not sure if we can.
Incumbents and regulators incumbents are always going to have a better outcome working with regulators than new players.
What drives me insane about that whole thing is much of the innovation is built on the backs of others. And then they use the regulatory system to stifle growth and expansion of those people and allow the incumbents who make all the money previously, who sat on their hands and didn't innovate, which is why the rest of us did, but now they still have an absolute unfair advantage in terms of their ability to scale and access these markets from a compliance perspective, which I think is, again, the antithesis of why the space was started, why we all joined, and what most of the technology is focused on. So
I mean, it's interesting if we think of some of the largest kind of crypto native players, I don't know, say Uniswap, say Aave, they've amassed an incredible amount of resources. So in principle, you could think of this strategy of becoming large enough, quickly enough outside of the regulatory framework, so that those new players can have enough influence on policymakers that they essentially start to behave like incumbents in terms of shaping policy going forward. And
here's the problem. Here's the problem with that, though, is you see things like ARK Invest and Grayscale and DCG and Coinbase, and these are fairly large, insanely well capitalized crypto native projects, but they still couldn't get the ETFs approved until BlackRock came in as an incumbent and threw their weight around. So I mean, you can be capitalized, but if you can't get freaking licenses approved, I'm really funny about this.
Yeah, but I guess my point was, I'm not sure that Uniswap and Aave or other kind of crypto native things like that are even trying to do that. It's not part of their strategy. So the only thing left is for incumbents to use the existing regulatory framework. I think it would be smart for some of these major crypto native projects that have become large and have tremendous resources to put a significant amount of effort into shaping new policy something
else that's not doing us a very good service, in my opinion, in terms of this incumbent advantage versus kind of native innovations. I think really is that the barriers to entry are very high. It's very expensive, obviously. But I mean, if you're a new entrant into the market and you see the headwinds, the cost, yet you turn to your left and your right and you see a lot of these incumbents coming in and just, being able to get licenses and do all of these things in ways that you can't. I'm concerned that, that's going to continue. We're not going to find a good solution to that.
I'm concerned about that too. Yeah.
And another thing that's, I think, harming us in a fairly significant way with respect to Stani and everybody at Aave and obviously Uniswap and the teams there and Compound and all these other groups and most of the VC world, crypto native VC world, for some reason is standing firm on one very polarizing end of the spectrum that decentralization will win and that regulators aren't going to be able to influence all of these quasi-financial products, which I completely disagree with, but I think it's harming the space. We're all sitting here holding on for dear life to this one end of the spectrum. Meanwhile, incumbents are calling a spade and just doing what they have to get approved, and they're going to eat everybody's lunch.
Yeah.
And
it's worse than that though, because you see a lot of this, pro decentralization posturing by VCs. I mean, look, I'm not trying. We're friends with a lot of VCs and have had do a lot of great work with a lot of VCs. So I'm not trying to kind of smear them, but there is a tendency, I think, to kind of parrot this pro decentralization view, but then also back kind of pro regulation projects that involve incumbents. And what we really don't see a lot of is backing of crypto native projects trying to do more in the regulated space, right? Because to a certain extent, it makes sense from a VC standpoint. If I'm looking at a project, if I'm kind of going through doing the due diligence for a project, and a project is telling me, hey, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z in terms of regulated securities or whatever, then if I see someone who worked on the securities desk at Goldman for 10 years, I'm going to find the project more credible if I'm a VC. So to a certain extent, it's like it is rational, but this pattern is here, right? The pattern is a lot of kind of pro decentralization speak, but then to the extent there are regulatory plays, back incumbent projects, right? And so I think it's even a little worse than what you described.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to give them the benefit of the doubt that obviously they're in it for the same reasons as us, not as us, but VCs, their primary goal is to invest in good businesses that have high probabilities of success and to make profit, obviously. Yeah. And so, I mean, I think in the short term, they're probably correct. The most hype, the most commitment, the most crypto native energy is given in some cases to these crypto native decentralized projects, but they would be stupid not to back incumbents, because we all know, whether I like it or not, the incumbent projects are going to be successful. There's nothing we can do about it. So, I mean, we'll have to see. I could probably
the incumbent projects have a lot more resources. They're able to kind of de-risk a lot of the kind of regulatory component of the operation from the standpoint of the VC. So it makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. Hey, just a quick shout out to the DGen Roundtable guys. I was on their Whiskey Wednesdays pod last night, which was really cool, actually. It's the first time I've been on it, but they do like an hour-ish like project spotlight. At least they did last night on a Pulse Chain kind of NFT game or something, card game, which was pretty cool. But then they have like 5 or 6 or 7 people from the community, and I happen to be one of them. Most of them are probably watching the pod today, so welcome to everybody that's watching. But anyways, all of this to say, we do this live Monday to Friday, 12:30 p.m. Eastern. The DGen Roundtable guys, they might be onto something. They do Whiskey Wednesdays, and they do it at 8 p.m. Eastern. So if you see me change my coffee for whiskey, we have 2 problems. One, I haven't drank in a decade. That's a problem. And the second one is it's the middle of the day. So if you start seeing us drink whiskey in the middle of the day, it's a funny day. Anyways, okay. I know we had a ton of stuff to talk about today. And we spent most of it talking about GSR, regulatory fragmentation, and risk premium. I think we're going to go to the last thing that's just a bit of a feel-good story, which I kind of like. And this is Australia. We've talked a lot about Australia over the last, let's call it year, because they've kind of flip-flopped a little bit. They were super stoked about a CBDC, and then they decided no CBDC, and they were super excited about regulation for crypto, and then they had like a blanket, we're not regulating crypto, we're just not allowing it. Anyways, they flip-flopped a lot, but I think now they've kind of found a path to being at the forefront of regulation. And what's really cool is one of the big venues, I think it's a football stadium called the Adelaide Oval. It's a sporting venue, but I'm pretty sure it's a football club. And they started allowing crypto payments at all of their concessions in this stadium, which I think is really cool. That's obviously a sign that, both societies and, large entities, organizations, sports teams, and payment infrastructures are getting to the point that we can actually do this stuff. And that's pretty exciting. Would you pay for food? at a football venue with crypto?
Maybe. I mean, I think it's interesting. It's a decision made by a private business, and they clearly have made the assessment that there's enough demand among their users to offer this to make this available. And so I think it's a great sign. I'm not sure how much it dovetails into the regulation discussion. I guess to the extent there's any implications related to kind of payment transmission in the U.S. There are all these money transmitter laws and so forth that come up when you start implementing these different payment infrastructures, particularly across state lines in the U.S. So I'm not sure kind of where that comes into play in Australia, but it's a private business decision, and I think it's a sign that more and more businesses are understanding that their users like to use crypto for various things. Do you know what coins they're accepting? Do we know what coins they're accepting?
No, and the article didn't say. Crypto.com is one of the payment services that's helping them with this. So it's not necessarily entirely on chain. I don't know the very specific details about it. But there's some ancillary benefits to this. And this is kind of what's interesting to me, is that for a group the size of a professional football team in Australia, they have to be pretty confident that they have the accounting infrastructure, that they have all of the legal infrastructure, to be able to make a move like this and accept this as a payment stream. I mean, there's a lot of other things that have to be in place from a tech stack perspective, monitoring, visibility, all of these things, that I think this is a good sign. We're starting to get to the point that these large institutions and entities feel confident enough to do this. Here's where I kind of chuckled when I first read this article, is in my head, my first gut reaction is I sure as shit hope they're not using ETH and Bitcoin, because the lineups will be atrocious. Waiting for those transactions to settle. I'm assuming there's some sort of centralization process here where we're not waiting for on-chain validation for the transactions to be completed. If that is the case, that it's all on-chain and we're waiting for transactions to be completed, we're probably seeing like Tron, Solana, like maybe XRP, like some of these kind of cheap, fast network assets. I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, I mean,
I totally do it. Just because it's cool.
That's a great point. My guess is it probably goes through, like you said, crypto. They partnered with Crypto.com, so probably Crypto.com has most of the tech infrastructure here, and they'll just process the payments very quickly by checking user balances, and it won't be that you wait for the transaction to process entirely on chain. All that being said, I think using crypto to pay for real world assets, just to pay for real world goods, I think is an important kind of scaling dimension. And one of the big challenges in terms of that scaling is how to convince sellers to accept crypto, right? I mean, because there are a lot of people who own crypto. I saw a number. There's some enormous number of Americans, tens of millions of Americans hold crypto, right? So a lot of individuals and households, families hold crypto, but not a lot of businesses accept crypto as payment. So the more we see businesses accepting crypto as payment, and the more we're kind of reducing the cost for businesses to onboard crypto as one of the methods of payment, I think we're moving in the direction of scaling, and I think it's a great sign.
Totally agree. I mean, for the longest time, it's felt like a bit of a pipe dream every time I hear crypto payments, because there just hasn't been the technological backup to actually facilitate that. But I think we're getting to the point now where that's really a thing. We're starting to see a lot of these improvements in the technology, so we can actually do this stuff at scale, which is really cool. Okay, we've gone over our time today. Clearly, you and I can talk a heck of a lot about these topics. I know we had some more. We're going to do a bit more of a deep dive, I think, on that regulatory risk premium one day, you and I, and we can talk about barriers to innovation and all of these different things that I know you have a lot of thoughts on. Okay, quick reminder to everybody: we're a live show Monday to Friday, 12:30 p.m. Eastern. Like, share, subscribe, hit the bell, do all that shit. Thanks for everybody that showed up today. If this is your first day and you heard about us through DGen Roundtable, welcome. I promise it's more organized and the production is a lot better when Kiara is back. But we're here to help you dispel myths, FUD, and dampen the FOMO and make smart choices and make some money in the space. With that, today I say to you, Patrick, go FUD yourself. Later.